1 Kings chapter 7. We begin to dive into the story about how Solomon built his own home as he was building the house of the Lord. And it'll go back and forth between what's being put into his home and what's being furnished in the temple. A lot of details in this passage, but we're going to unpack it and we're going to learn more about the life of Solomon. Verse 1. It took Solomon 13 years, however, to complete the construction of his palace. Now, that's a long time. Most projects in today's world can take as short as 6 months, as long as 18 months. This project took 13 years. Imagine the patience that Solomon walked in. I always appreciate that about him, a man who has everything, but yet in this area he has patience. He wanted it done perfectly. And there's a principle we can pull from that, believe it or not. In our life, there are times where we can often try to run ahead and do something quickly, but we don't always get the end desired result. And so one of the things that the Bible talks about in picture and principle in its fullness is the fruit of the Spirit, patience. That in our life, we're to be men and women that exhibit patience. It's to one's glory to overlook an offense and to have patience, Proverbs would say. Solomon would write that we're to have patience with one another. But we're not just to have patience with one another. We're to have patience in the way that we live our life because God moves in God's timing. And sometimes things don't move in alignment with the timing we would desire. And so we hear in the beginning of this chapter that Solomon was willing to wait 13 years for his palace to be constructed. It said he built the palace of the forest of Lebanon 100 cubits long, 50 wide, and 30 high, with 4 rows of cedar columns supporting trimmed cedar beams. It was roofed with cedar above the beams that rested on the columns, 45 beams, 15 to a row. Its windows were placed high in sets of 3 facing each other. All the doorways had rectangular frames. They were in the front part in sets of 3 facing each other. So you can begin to see that he is very particular in his design. The symmetry of his design is very important to him. The quality of the wood for his home is very important to him. Just as we learned when he built the temple of the Lord, as he builds his own home, that quality and craftsmanship are things that are very important to King Solomon. That he doesn't just want things done, he wants things done a certain way. In your life and in my life, God doesn't just want things done. The Bible uses this big word. It says that he wants things done in the prescribed way. So when God goes out of his way to share with us something he wants done a certain way, we need to make it a priority to accomplish all that he has, because Solomon's a great king, but Jesus is the King of Kings. And it says that he made a colonnade 50 cubits long and 30 wide. In front of it was a portico. And in front of that were pillars and an overhanging roof. He built the throne hall, the hall of justice, where he was to judge, and he covered it with cedar from floor to ceiling. And the palace in which he was to live, set further back, was similar in design. Solomon also made a palace like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had married. Okay, so we begin to see the beginning of some of Solomon's wise business decisions, poor spiritual and leadership decisions. You say, what does that mean? Solomon would have many trade agreements with many nations and would have many friends in business. And to solidify these agreements, he would marry individuals from these nations, which was a cultural thing in those days, to solidify the relationship. However, he would then find himself influenced by the people that he married. The New Testament principle is quite simple. It says, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. We're not to marry someone who's not a believer because they could influence us to turn from God. And that's exactly what began to happen in the life of Solomon when he married Pharaoh's daughter. All these structures, from the outside to the greatest courtyard and from foundation to eaves, were made of blocks and high-grade stone cut to size and smoothed on their inner and outer faces. The foundations were laid with large stones of good quality, some measuring 10 cubits and some 8. Above were high-grade stones cut to size and cedar beams. The great courtyard was surrounded by a wall of 3 courses of dressed stones and 1 course of trimmed cedar beams, as was the inner courtyard of the temple of the Lord with its portion. Now the Bible begins to segue. You might have a header in your scripture that talks about the temple furnishings, and I'm just going to prepare you. This chapter is a little longer. It's like 50 verses, and we're 13 in. So we're going to pick up the pace because he's going to cover a lot of details that are very hard in our mind to imagine, but the Bible goes into great detail to share the particulars, and really it's to show us the intentionality. I'm going to read it all, but the main premise is quite simple. is to show us the intentionality, how we should be intentional to do things God's way. And we need to be intentional when we do things in our own life. For King Solomon sent to Tyre and brought Huram, whose mother was a widow from the tribe of Naphtali, and whose father was from Tyre and a skilled craftsman in bronze. Huram was filled with wisdom, with understanding, with knowledge to do all kinds of bronze work. He came to King Solomon and did all the work assigned to him. For he cast 2 bronze pillars, each 18 cubits high and 12 cubits in circumference. He also made 2 capitals of cast bronze to set on the tops of the pillars. Each capital was 5 cubits high. A network of interwoven chains adorned the capitals on the top of the pillars, 7 for each capital. He made pomegranates in 2 rows, encircling each network to decorate the capitals on top of the pillars. He did the same for each capital. Verse 19. The capitals on top of the pillars in the portico were in the shapes of lilies, 4 cubits high. On the capitals of both pillars, above the bowl-shaped part next to the network, were the 200 pomegranates in rows all around. He erected the pillars at the portico of the temple. The pillar to the south he named Jachin, and the one to the north, Boaz. The capitals on top were in the shape of lilies, and so the work on the pillars was completed. For he made the sea of cast metal, circular in shape, measuring 10 cubits from rim to rim and 5 cubits high. It took a line of 30 cubits to measure around it. Below the rim, gourds encircled it, 10 to a cubit. The gourds were cast in 2 rows in one piece with the sea. For the sea stood on the 12 bowls, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south, and 3 facing east. Very, very symmetrical, if you will. The sea rested on top of them, and their hindquarters were toward the center. It was a handbreadth in thickness, and its rim was like the rim of a cup, like a lily blossom. It held 2,000 baths, and your margin will say that's about 12,000 gallons. You might be thinking at this point, I don't even understand most of the things that they're talking about, and I can't picture this in my mind. Don't worry, neither can I. I can't picture in my mind exactly what this looks like. It's very hard to come to this picture of what it was, but the Bible is describing it for those of you who are visual and have that kind of imagination, which I don't. It's describing it so that we can understand the beauty of what is being built. Verse 27, he also made 10 movable stands of bronze. Each was 4 cubits long, 4 wide, and 3 high. This is how the stands were made. They had side panels attached to uprights. On the panels between the uprights were lions, bulls, and cherubim, and on the uprights as well. Above and below the lions and bulls were wreaths of hammered work. Each stand had 4 bronze wheels with bronze axles, and each had a basin resting on 4 supports, cast with wreaths on each side. On the inside of the stand there was an opening that had a circular frame, 1 cubit deep. This opening was round, and with its basework it measured 1.5 cubits. Around its opening there was engraving. The panels of the stands were square, not round, and the 4 wheels were under the panels, and the axles of the wheels were attached to the stand. The diameter of each wheel was 1.5 cubits. The wheels were made like chariot wheels. The axles, rims, spokes, and hubs were all cast of metal. Each stand had 4 handles, one on each corner, projecting from the stand. Verse 35, and at the top of the stand there was a circular band 0.5 cubits deep. The supports and panels were attached to the top of the stand, for he engraved cherubim, lions, and palm trees on the surfaces of the supports and on the panels, and every available space with wreaths all around. For this is the way he made the 10 stands. They were all cast in the same molds and were identical in size and shape. He then made 10 bronze basins, each holding 40 baths and measuring 4 cubits across, 1 basin to go on each of the 10 stands. For he placed 5 stands on the south side of the temple and 5 on the north. He placed the sea on the south side and at the southeast corner of the temple. He also made the pots and shovels and sprinkling bowls. So Huram finished all the work he had undertaken for King Solomon in the temple of the Lord. This man Huram, who was a skilled craftsman from the tribe of Naphtali, did a lot for King Solomon. So much so that he received a mention in the Bible. And I want to pause right there for 1 second and share something with you. Because sometimes in life we can find ourselves with a skill and a craft that we think isn't noticed. We might look at ourselves and say, well, I'm not King Solomon. But I want to tell you this. Huram was used by God, and Huram was noticed by God. And the Bible goes out of its way to describe in great detail, even though sometimes it can be a little bit boring. I'm sure every time Huram hears this story, Huram gets excited. And I just want you to know that heaven tells your story too. And it's okay to get excited. Because there's things that you do that other people don't see. But God sees, and he notices every detail, and he notices the excellence that you do it in. The Bible says that Huram finished all the work. And this is what he had done. The 2 pillars, the 2 bowl-shaped capitals on top of the pillars, the 2 sets of network decorating the 2 bowl-shaped capitals on top of the pillars, the 400 pomegranates for the 2 sets of network, the 10 stands with their 10 basins, the sea and the 12 bowls under it, the pots, shovels, and sprinkling bowls. All these objects that Hiram made for King Solomon from the temple of the Lord were on burnished bronze. For the king had cast them in clay molds in the plain of Jordan between Succoth and Zarethan. Solomon left all these things unweighed because they were so many. The weight of the bronze was not determined. Solomon also made all the furnishings that were in the Lord's temple, the golden altar, the golden table in which was the bread of presence, the lampstands of pure gold, 5 on the right and 5 on the left in front of the inner sanctuary, the gold floral work and lamps and tongs, the pure gold basins, wick trimmers, sprinkling bowls, dishes, and censers, and the gold sockets for the doors of the innermost room, the most holy place, and also for the doors of the main hall of the temple. When all the work King Solomon had done for the temple of the Lord was finished, he brought in the things his father David had dedicated, the silver and gold and the furnishings, and he placed them in the treasuries of the Lord's temple. With great intentionality was the temple of the Lord built. With great intentionality was the palace of Solomon built. If there's a theme, if there's a principle through this chapter that's woven in the current, it's the importance of being intentional. Unpack this in your own life. Unpack this in your own walk with God. What has God called you to be intentional today? And sometimes it might feel boring and mundane, like everything that we listed off. But it's essential and purposeful. It's essential and purposeful. What is it in our life that God has called us to be intentional to? An example that I could give you is my son at this point in time, he's 2 years old. Every night I'm telling him a story out of the Bible. I don't even know if he understands it. Sometimes he looks at me like I'm clueless. And it can feel boring and mundane. But I know that as I do it by faith, I'm planting the seed of the word inside of him. And I believe that one day it's going to come forth and it's going to flourish. And it might feel like bronze and boring today. But one day in his life, we're going to turn the page and it's going to be like gold. And he's going to shine. Whatever God calls you to do it with excellence as unto the Lord. Be blessed today.